So, our keynote for this morning is going to be handled by Trish Hepworth, who is the Deputy CEO of Australian Library and Informations Association. I didn't say that right, that's me. In which role she is overseeing the association's Professional Pathways Initiative. This initiative marks a significant investment of the association in a diverse, supported and valued library and information workforce with skills, knowledge and ethics needed to deliver library and information services that anticipate the needs of the community now into the future. Would you welcome Trish Hepworth?
And good. Now this is working. Yes, brilliant. Hello everybody. It is lovely to be here today on the lands of the Kaurna people, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. And I want to acknowledge and respect any First Nations people who are joining us today, either in person or online. I also want to acknowledge that the First Nations people of our country, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, have held the knowledge of this country for millennium in the oldest continuing cultures in the world. I also want to acknowledge that the colonisation and the forced dispossession of First Nations people in this country to a large extent destroyed what we might consider to be the libraries, the ways of keeping knowledge and knowing in the landscape through community, through elders, through tradition, and was systematically shattered across a large area of the country. And that is something that we are still recovering from, and something which we could all do to learn a little bit more about. I don't have time. I know I've got an hour, which seems like an insane amount of time, but I really do not have time to go in depth into First Nations ways of knowing and being. But what I would like everybody to do today is, these are names. I was going to put up a list of suggested readings, and I know exactly what happens when you do that. People look at it, and some people take a photo, and nobody ever reads anything. So this is the easier way. These are all First Nations excellent people who work in libraries, and they are all on LinkedIn, so you can find them really easy. A heap of them are on other social media platforms. Just go and follow a couple of them. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just the first ones that came to mind when I did it this morning. Go and follow a couple of them. Make sure that you are suddenly actively curating your social media feeds and your professional feeds to put some of these voices in. And then from there, pick up the things that look interesting, follow the people that they are following, and actively work at building your network and your knowledge. There's my one command, because I get one command as a keynote speaker. Sarah said so. My one command for you all today. So, as I said, I'm not going to go into Indigenous ways of knowing and being. What I am going to do instead is give you a much more potted history, really around a more, for want of a better word, Western concepts around libraries, to talk through some of those concepts of open, where they came from, what they might look like now, and what they might look like into the future. And I did say in my abstract that this was going to be a potted history, and it's okay, because we all know the histories of libraries, right? There was a giant, great library of Alexandria, and it caught fire, and then we had the Dark Ages, and that's why we don't have flying cars. Finn. Right, so now that's all in your heads. As everybody knows, that's actually not quite true. Okay, some of you probably didn't know that, and I'm sorry to have shattered your dreams. It did not quite happen like that. But it is a really resonant story, right? That symbol of the great library of Alexandria, I will actually learn how to say that holds the world's knowledge and it burns down and it throws the world into darkness is a story with resonance. It is still the go-to metaphor that people reach for. And it has the feel of truthiness. You know, there are things that are true and factual, and then there are things that are truthy. And things that are truthy are often much stronger than things that are true, because they're the ones that you feel right in your heart. And it's hard to shift them. One of the ones I like to talk about quite often is, do people remember the hoo-ha over the health star ratings on fruit juice, where people were like, what do you mean that Diet Cola might have a better health star rating than orange juice? And it didn't matter how true that was. It did not feel truthy, so people would not believe it. And so that symbol of the destruction of knowledge holds deep and truthy resonance. And it is an interesting thing to separate where is the truth in that and what is it that we're scared of. Because the truthy things are often things that we are scared of. And I think that feeling about losing the enlightenment, the knowledge, the fear of going backwards is something that is really resonant as we go into the future at the moment. Like many people, I've been told that you have to actually introduce yourself at some point in the speech, so this seemed as good a point as any. This is me. This is what I do in my day job. I look after libraries. What I do a lot of is I talk to libraries and I work out what they need, and then I go and translate it into wanky policy and legal talk and hopefully try and get a world which is really favourable to libraries. I like to use this picture because it makes me look really professional. Also, I like to use this picture because if anybody actually wants to go and have a look at the recording of the inquiry into the government's Revive National Cultural Policy, which the Parliament makes freely available, so anyone can go, just like Hansard is freely available. We like things that are open and accessible. If you want to go and watch the video, you can also watch the 5 minutes at the beginning where I failed to put my chair down and I was bouncing up and down like a ping pong ball, and the assistants came out and helped me, and nobody could help me, so I did this entire hearing with my feet dangling like this. But I still look professional. Anyway, that's my day job. I'm not a librarian, just for the record. I'm a lawyer, which is why I talk lawyer speak. I will try not to talk too much lawyer speak. So, libraries. Where do we go for libraries? If you talk to the British Museum, they will tell you that the first great library was the Library of Ashurbanipal. Now, in fairness, this is mainly because the British Museum had a giant exhibition about the Library of Ashurbanipal, and it was a good bit of marketing. But it's a nice place to start. We've got no idea when the first libraries were. We know that we have really ancient references to them across the Fertile Crescent, through China, and it would be really surprising if we didn't have them in Egypt as well. Ashurbanipal, however, had a really great love of books. We know that because he stole them from absolutely everybody. Had a really good collection development policy, which was basically, I'm going to go and conquer somebody, and then I'm going to take all their books, and I'm going to take their clay tablets, and I'm going to take their papyrus scrolls, and I'm going to take it all back. And when I take it back to my palace, I'm going to put an inscription on the front of it that basically threatens you with curses and terrible things if you dare take this book out of my personal library. I do like to point this out to any librarians who try and get me to run campaigns to change the public's perception of librarians, and I point out we are dealing with like 3,000 years of history here. One of the things that is interesting about Ashurbanipal is that it's one of the earliest records we have of this being really noticed as a concept. Ashurbanipal collected everything. So a lot of divination, because that was really popular and very powerful, but the Epic of Gilgamesh we have from the Library of Ashurbanipal. He went and conquered places and then took back their administrative documents. because he knew that knowledge is power. So power to the person who then has all of that information, but also the deprivation of power if you take it from somebody else and they no longer have access. I use the word knowledge because it sounds sexier than information or data, but at various points you can just insert different words where they are relevant. And when we're talking about knowledge and power, this is one of the things I want to talk about a lot today. When you control the container in which knowledge is held, you are controlling that knowledge. So if you have all of the information written on a clay tablet, and you pick up that clay tablet and you take it from that city over there, and you take it to Nineveh, and you put it in a room, and you throw a curse mark on the front of it, and you only let 3 people say it, you actually don't just control that container, that clay tablet. You also, to an extent, control the knowledge that is in that clay tablet. None of that's controversial, so you can just all nod. So, that's the first library. There are some fairly obvious challenges about calling it a library, like the fact it was just actually his own personal collection of loot, but we'll start with that one. We then move through to a flourishing of libraries, and some of you will recognise the Great Library of Alexandria from the beautiful game Assassin's Creed, from which this screenshot is taken. I would just like to pause for a moment to say they did a really good job. This is actually probably reasonably accurate. You can see that the bulk of the collection is papyrus scrolls, which is why they've got this sort of cross-hatching so you can fit your scrolls in without them all falling out over the place. A lot of light because a lot of people are reading and a lot of people are copying. So actually really good work, and I had to just pause and critique the Assassin's Creed because most of this is public domain. This is not a public domain image, fairly obviously, but now that I've talked about it, it's fair dealing for criticism and review, so we're safe. Nice hack, eh? So, a lot of copying. We had libraries at this stage throughout the Roman Empire, throughout the Fertile Crescent. The Roman Empire in particular and the Greeks before them had these fantastic institutions where people would come together, they would collate the scrolls, they would bring in new scrolls, they would copy, they would talk, they would build vibrant communities. And so when Alexander the Great decided that he wanted to build a new city, he used the library as an attraction. And this is one of those key other themes that will come through, which is that knowledge can equal prestige, and prestige can equal money. And so if you are trying to convince people to come to the end of the world in a brand new city when they've got perfectly excellent cities, one of the things you can do is build a giant library and then hype it up like nothing else and get the cool people or the thinking people to come and build a community and boost your prestige as being a centre of learning. You can then pretty much do what Ashurbanipal did. For a long time, the people of Alexandria, and it was a well-known thing, if a ship came in, they'd go in and they'd steal the scrolls, basically, and they'd copy them out, and then they'd give them back, but they wouldn't give them back the originals, they'd give them back the copy, and then off they go. So we're talking of but what was different between Ashurbanipal and these libraries that were through the Roman Empire was that copying thing. So it wasn't just, I am keeping this for me. It was an active thought that it is better if this knowledge is circulating. So we want to copy here, we want to build a community here, but we also want to be receiving and transferring knowledge. And it's through that we really did see a lot of flourishing of science, of literature, of arts. And it's why when we hear of the Great Fire of Alexandria, it's such an emotive topic. Now, there was definitely a fire of Alexandria. The chances are that it didn't actually burn down the library, which is a bit of a downer for the myth. The chances are, in fact, that most of the library by that stage was pretty dissolute because they ran out of money and nobody was paying the rent, and there were rats and there were some plagues, and to hark back to Monday, maintenance is more important than creation. So you can create a fantastic library, and if you don't keep paying the rent and you don't keep paying the staff, it falls apart. Okay. We all then know what happened. We had the Dark Ages, and lots of little tiny monks were like writing away in their scriptoriums, and everything was dark and sad. But these guys kept the lights on, and that is why we managed to pull out at the other end of the Renaissance, right? That's what we all know? Yeah. We know that's not quite true as well, right? Yeah, right. Brilliant. So, a couple of things. Yes, monks absolutely did a fantastic job at various stages. And they absolutely did do a lot of copying, especially of religious texts, as an act of devotion. And they were writing on parchment, and parchment is really, really, really expensive because you make it out of animals. So we're talking about a limited skill set because not many people were literate. We're talking about a really expensive medium. We are not talking about a flourishing of books within Western Europe. On the other hand, we had this entire thing called the Eastern Roman Empire. We had the Persians, we had the Chinese. They all had lots of things that they could write on. Byzantium in particular had parchment but was rich, so it had a lot of parchment and a lot of literate people. And so we see across that Eastern Europe thing an absolute continuation of that library, and especially with the rise of Islam, we see a huge emphasis on religious libraries as educational places. So libraries that were being looked after and collections that were being developed with the purpose of making sure that the whole community was learning and the whole community was literate. And that's because, and we saw it with Alexandria, and we see this going through, people understand that communities are greater than the sum of their parts, and that they, in and of themselves, actually have benefits wider than the small group of people who are there. And also, everyone's always worried about everybody else's education, generally in a negative way. So, we're flipping a little bit. I did tell you it's potted history. Not quite at 4 slides, but it is a potted history. Everyone knows what this is, right? Anyone? You can read the caption if it hasn't fallen off the bottom. Oh, it's fallen off the bottom. Oops. It's a Gutenberg Bible. So, printing. Talking printing, right? So one reason that the Persians and the Chinese and had a lot better libraries is they had paper a lot earlier. But paper turned up in Western Europe, and then, of course, we got printing. And printing is a game changer in Western Europe because it suddenly means that what you had of a high cost to replicate becomes a low cost to replicate. And we see the flourishing of fantastic libraries. So this is the Bodleian Library in the UK because it's really pretty, and I think people who had a late night last night might like to look at something that's really pretty. I've never been also, so I'm a little bit jealous. But we see the flourishing of the great university libraries through Europe in this stage that are really looking at fostering that scholarship in those communities. One of the interesting things, the Bodleian actually predates printing, but then comes around for printing. The other reason I wanted to use the Bodleian is it was one of the first libraries that ended up with something that looked like what we call legal deposit. So they made this agreement with the Stationers Guild, and basically every book that they printed in the UK, they gave a copy to the Bodleian. And so we are starting to see at this point collections and the ambition that we can collect the whole of human knowledge. Now, I say this, but obviously, actually, that didn't happen because the Bodleian took itself quite seriously because it was university and they didn't want the crap that was being published. They just wanted the good stuff. So they had the right to get anything. They chose the stuff. They were particularly down on certain languages, for example. But it starts that real thought that we could collect everything and then make it available. We're fast forwarding a little bit quickly here as well. And so we've got this sort of start of printing. We've got much lower costs. We have a society that is becoming more and more mechanised. And you remember that bit where everybody's always worried about everybody else's education. That is really coming to the fore. And we start doing things like creating mechanics institutes. Who's been to the State Library down the road? Okay. And now, everybody who didn't put up your hand, put up your hand. Right, clock all those people. You're all going to the State Library before you leave, okay? Right, excellent. Now, I realised I was only allowed one command, but you can't choose, you can do two of them. It's 2 blocks down that way, walk up. The first building that you come to at the State Library is actually the Institute building. And the Institute building was the old Mechanics Institute in South Australia. And Mechanics Institutes were basically collective societies, and they got together and they built what they called subscription libraries, so people could join the library and then they could come in and they could read. And they ran programs and they ran lectures and they educated each other in a really collaborative and communal place. There are still some around at the moment. This is the Athenaeum in Melbourne, and if you're in Melbourne you can actually pay a subscription and join and use their collection. It's also really gorgeous and in the middle of Melbourne, and if you join you can also sit there and do all of your work every time you're on a business trip. So, pro tip. Following shortly on the heels of the Mechanics Institutes, we have that flourishing of public libraries. So this is the Boston Public Library, and you probably can't see, and I couldn't find a easily Creative Commons licensed photo in my 3 seconds of searching. But above this lady here, it says free for all. And we're starting to see that public library mission that says it does not matter who you are, you also should have access to information. You also should have access to knowledge. You also should have access to culture. This is the State Library of Victoria. Australia moved very early on public libraries. So State Library Victoria's mid-1800s, and we similarly saw other great state libraries, like the State Library of South Australia, which you are all about to go to, flourishing through this period. It's a really important flip, and it talks a lot about the fact that both that everyone was worried about other people's education, but that community ownership of what the solution would be, because the public libraries are community and government funded. So they are, in a way, the Mechanics Institute collaboration to come together on a wider scale through a government purpose. Okay, the container matters. All of that happened because we moved to printing. If we still had parchment, we would probably not have public libraries in the same way that we have public libraries. We're doing a little segue for a second into not libraries but librarians. The British Museum likes to say that Ashurbanipal was the first ever librarian, and I would like to disagree, because stealing things and then pettily writing that it's mine on the front of things is not actually core librarian skills, no matter what you might think. Almost as insulting is the other narrative around libraries, and actually most of this talk was entirely an excuse to put this slide in, because I don't know if you recognise him, but this is Casanova, who is obviously... Who knows who Casanova is? Yeah, right. So he's the world's greatest lover, right? Also one of the world's worst librarians. But I did entirely put this slide in just to make sure that everybody in the world knows that the world's greatest lover was a librarian. Quite terrible. He spent a decade and a half being a librarian for a private collection. He was meant to institute a fantastic cataloguing system. Instead, he wrote his own memoirs, pissed off all of the people around him, to the point where they were using the collection to wipe their bottoms. So, you know, possibly not a great librarian. But one of the narratives we get in a lot of the library history books is that we didn't really have librarians. Around. What we got is people like Casanova who were looking after special collections, and it was really just a bit of a I shouldn't say crapshoot in a barrel, but you know, it was one of those things. That is a narrative that you read a lot, especially in books that are written by people who write history of libraries because they really like books, and they write histories of libraries that concentrate a lot on what really rich people in Europe did with their private collections because that's where all the cool books were. That is obviously not where most of the libraries actually were. And I tell you what, if you're in Byzantium and you are looking after a collection of a couple of 100,000 works in mixed medium for a bunch of grumpy scholars and educationalists and palace officials, you darn well have library skills. And we know that people have library skills because we have people like Livy back in the Roman Empire complaining about their librarians and the dodginess of their catalogues. Some things never change. But it would be true to say that we didn't have an official school or an official framework in many ways for librarian skills. And that really changed with the advent of university libraries first and then public libraries, as we were getting more standardised, and the libraries in particular were talking more and more to each other in linked up networks, and you needed actual skills. And along with skills that go with librarianship, one of the things that makes a profession is values. And we really saw in the 1900s a coalescence of what library values actually looked at. You will note I don't put many words on my slides, so I don't actually do the terrible thing of reading words out on slides much, but I am going to talk through what is on this slide. So these are Rangnathan's 5 laws of library science. These are like the Bible laws for library students. These were sort of the original distillation of what's the difference between a collection of books that you're looking after and a library. And he said, books are for use. So the collection and the preservation and all of those things are important, but they're important as a means to the end, because what we have here is containers of knowledge, and what we need people to do is actually access what's in there. So people need to use books. There's no point just putting them on the shelves. Every person, his or her book, which means basically that libraries are there for the whole community. So it doesn't matter if you are high status or low status. You've got high education, low education. If you have a disability, if you come from a different caste system, you should be able to come in and use that library collection and find the thing that you need there. Which, for the same thing, every book has its readers. So you need that collection to be for all of your readers. So you don't just collect the things that you like. You don't just collect the pretty books or the books that you think are worthwhile. You collect the books that your community actually needs. You have to save the time of the reader. That means you have to do your job properly. You've got to make things easy to find. You've got to make them accessible. You've got to make them usable. And the library is a growing organism, so it changes. And as the world around it changes, libraries change. So these are some fairly key concepts. He's an awesome person. You should go and read about him too. That's not a command, but it's a great suggestion. So please do it. Okay, we're going to segue back out of the history of librarians, though it kind of fits chronologically, and back into the history of libraries. So we're back in Australia. Everyone recognises this bit of technology that we all hoped would be obsolete and apparently isn't, the photocopier. You can all see the really important thing in this photo, right? It's that. So, Frank Morehouse. Who's heard of Frank Morehouse? Lots of people have heard of Frank Morehouse. Oh, geez. Frank Morehouse, by the way, is one of Australia's most famous intellects, academics and authors. So more of you should have put up your hand. But the reason that we care about him most is because he sued the University of New South Wales Library. And why did he sue the University of New South Wales Library? Because they had one of those. And did he sue them because he could never make it work and he had to kick it in the right special place to make it put out the piece of paper? No, he didn't. He actually sued them because it was working. And we're talking about that rise of technology here. So what happened, obviously, is the University of New South Wales put photocopiers into their libraries and everybody got really scared because with printing, we'd made the cost of reproducing quite low, but we'd made but it was still a very high barrier to who could reproduce, right? So you basically had to be a printer to reproduce things. What a photocopier did meant that anybody could reproduce, and people got really scared about that. So Frank Mulhouse sued the University of New South Wales. He won, which is why there are no photocopiers in libraries anymore. That is obviously false. I'm so glad some people picked that up. He won, which means that they then changed the law, and in the regulations it says the library will not be liable for authorising copyright infringement as long as they put this very important notice behind their photocopier that reminds people that they're not allowed to breach copyright. I am not kidding. You can go and look it up in the regulations. It specifies the exact wording, the exact format, the exact font size, and the exact size of the piece of paper. And that is why, to this day, if you walk into a library, that piece of paper will be behind that photocopier, because that is the legal protection for the library about copyright authorisation. Random segue for the day, but it was the start of a huge set of copyright wars. So we then see that decade of technological change, and we see the wars being fought everywhere. Can we tape things on videotape? Do we want to start every video with a "you cannot download this car"? show. Raging copyright wars, because what we had done is we had not just dropped the cost of reproducing stuff, but we had dropped the opportunity for reproducing stuff, and copyright owners everywhere were really, really scared. And the wars raged for decades, and some people won some, and some people won others. This was 1975. And so throughout the next, pretty much to this day, we had this fight, right? Because who's controlling that container? And so that was 1975. We fight. We hit the early 1990s. I was alive then, so I should know how to say it. If anybody didn't, by the way, catch Sarah's fantastic talk on open access on Monday, go and look at the recording, because I'm going to skim over open access like this. Whink! I'm so proud I didn't fall over. I'm so glad you're proud of me too. This is the best community. We see the things like archive really happening, right? So this is where people are suddenly going, the internet is here, computers are here, we can start doing this sharing and communicating with very limited barriers, and that is going to make us faster, it is going to make us stronger, it is going to absolutely turbocharge our advancement. And we saw things like the subversive proposals for electronic publishing come through at this stage, which is, you know what, we could make all of this stuff available on the web. I may not have fallen over, but it turns out I can't manage the clicker. We can make all of this stuff available for the web anytime, any place. This is a huge democratization of knowledge. It is going to turbocharge it. And some of these work better than others, right? So archive's still going today because it's fantastic and it has a strong community. It had robust infrastructure, and it's a community who saw the value and were happy to contribute and agreed upon basically terms that would make it work. Scholarly publishing, on the other hand, open access is a raging mess of a battle. And some of that is because by the time we were actually moving into that space, we had already lost so many battles, and the battle lines were drawn, and people had strapped on their armour and their weapons, and they were full the way down the road before we'd even started. And one of the big things around scholarly publishing, as we all know, is we go back to this bit around Alexandria, right? Where you say knowledge is prestige and prestige is dollars. And what scholarly publishers really do very well in the for-profit market is that they sell the prestige, right? That's what they're selling, the prestige. But they make their value because what they get is the copyright. And as we know, they then control the container of the copyright, which is the container of the knowledge. So they are buying the knowledge equals power while selling the prestige. And it's a really effective marketing, really effective business model, which makes it very strong. And it also means that at the end of the day, the control of the knowledge sits with a for-profit publisher for the majority of scholarly publishing. And that has significant challenges, right? So we all know the challenges with paywalls around scholarly publishing. We have anyone who's ever been involved in the academia side of, say, open source will know the challenges of reading a published paper on open source that is in a for-profit journal behind a paywall. And I would just like to put up my hand and say, by the way, we don't have an open access library journal for the association yet, so I'm not going to throw any stones on this one. Working on it. But that was obviously not great. So we saw a lot of activity, especially in the early 2000s. And so the Budapest Open Access Initiative really sort of kick-started some of those key things that says, okay, well, how do we change the business model that means that people can actually start getting access to things? And one of the other big things that happened around that time is that we saw things like Wikipedia come through, which said, well, what can we do that's different? What's a different model? A crowdsourcing model? How will this work? We saw things like Creative Commons. So it was like, it's not just the business model, but how do we give people the tools that they need to make open a reality? Because if you don't have something like a Creative Commons licensing system and your barrier to open is copyright, then you don't give people the tools that they need to be able to do open. And I'm talking libraries, so I'm talking Creative Commons, but open software licensing, exactly the same sort of principles. So, we're moving out of open access publishing for a second and talking about other things which are technologically exciting. So, anyone ever go to Pandora? Yeah, I love Pandora. So, Australia's Web Archive, we do a whole of domain harvest every year. So, Pandora started in 1996 with a whole of domain harvest. It's now all sort of rolled into Trove, but we still do a whole of domain harvest every year in Australia. The legislation, just for the record, that actually allows the whole of domain harvest to go as part of legal deposit was in 2016. You might notice there's a slight time difference between 96 and 2016. But, you know, without Pandora, we wouldn't have the Sydney Olympics webpage anymore. So there's a very strong use case for why we'd want to do it. And this talks to one of those other aspects of open, right? Which is we can say open, but what is it that we're doing open? And unless we're collecting it, then it's not open because it will just disappear. If the National Library had not collected the 2000s Olympics page, which, you know, some people might actually want to go back and remember what our terrible mascots looked like, we wouldn't have it. So, we collect a lot of stuff, This is a photo from the National Library. This is one of their off-site storages. You know, people who deal with servers and everything know that actually storage takes up a lot of money. It takes up a lot of energy. It takes up a lot of space. Physical takes up a lot of space. We, in library world, as you were unsurprised to know, we count shelf space in kilometres. And if we're storing stuff like the Web Archive, or we're storing stuff like all of these special collections, we want to be able to make it available. And so the libraries have done a lot of work digitising as much as they possibly can of historical records. And copyright for us is one of those real barriers. So this, for example, comes from the letter book of James Cook. It's an unpublished work, which means it was never published, which means up until recently it was perpetually in copyright, because copyright didn't start running until you'd published something. So if it was perpetually in copyright, you couldn't digitise it without clearing it with the copyright owner. And who knows who is the copyright owner from something that is handwritten from the mid-1700s. So one of the things that we did a couple of years ago was we actually managed to get some changes through to copyright law. One was to get unpublished works out of perpetual copyright. Another really important one was to get the disability copyright provisions through. And so they're the ones that say, actually, say I've got, for example, a visual impediment that means I can't read something on paper, I should be able to get a screen reader to read that to me because I still need to be able to access that content. So we're talking about how do we change laws and copyright laws to make sure that things are accessible. So that means real accessibility. It doesn't mean theoretically they're accessible for somebody who has money to go to the National Library and get somebody to retrieve it for them and has perfect sight. It means actually I can put this online, I can crowdsource a transcription so that it's machine readable, and then somebody who is blind is able to read the darn thing. That is actual accessibility. And a lot of that comes through legal change and resourcing. Okay, now we can get up to the present day. Did you enjoy your history lesson? You are so polite. I'm just going to take it at face value. The container matters. We remember that, right? Okay. Everyone's seen this one, right? I prefer the rock one myself, but you knew you couldn't escape without talking about generative AI. So the container matters. And at the moment, the container that we are being pushed for accessing knowledge is a generative AI interface, right? So now when I say, how do I get the cheese to stick onto my pizza? It'll tell me that I should listen to Reddit threads from 20 years ago. There's still a stack of really fun ones to do. I Googled. One of my favourite ones at the moment is to Google Elena Ferrante, who is a famous author who is actually anonymous. Nobody knows who she, maybe he, is. It tells you exactly what day she was born and gives you a photo. We are, as I said, being pushed very hard that the interface for the container for knowledge at the moment will be generative AI. What does generative AI do that might be a step change? So, as we've talked about containers before, we had, containers that were nice clay tablets that you could pick up, take, put somewhere. We had containers then and the usage around it that was like we will be able to write more things, put things down more easily, but it's still hard to replicate. We got the printing press and it really drove down that replication rate, but within a tight circle because ability was still high. We suddenly had photocopiers and then we had digital and we had the internet, which meant that that price of replication and the ability to replicate went right down. And the step change with generative AI is that it changes the barriers on creation. So suddenly it is really cheap to create words, and it is really cheap to create images. And the barriers to being able to do that are really low. And that is a real substantial change, and I don't entirely know what it means. But we have always had an intellectual property system that is based on the scarcity in a way of creation, because creation takes all the effort. Now you can say to generative AI, please give me 20 chairs with these sort of proportions, but all slightly different, and it will just pump them out. Now, I'm not saying that everything that generative AI gives you is good. But it is actually really effective at writing and creating certain types of content. If you wanted to write you a scammy marketing email, it is darn good, I have to say. So we are looking at a fundamental change because creation suddenly is easy. Creation is suddenly easier. And that means things like the replacement issues are huge for creators. When everybody can create something that a copy editor would do, what does that do? As an interesting sort of side note on this too, in Australia at least, pure outputs from generative AI most probably do not have copyright protection, which gives you a really interesting thought into that economic thing, because you pay an author, that work is copyrightable, so you have a financial way of protecting it. Financial way of protecting a financial return. If that comes out of generative AI, not so much. So that economic thing doesn't work as well, except there's no transparency. So how do you know? So that practical and legal mishmash suddenly becomes really interesting. So let's have a think about it. For anyone who wasn't at Kathy's talk yesterday, you should go and definitely listen to Kathy's talk about tokenization. I want to have a little bit of talk about control. Who's controlling the containers? And what do we do about it? So we definitely have this quite legitimate fear, I think, that generative AI models are siphoning up all of the world's information for their own ends. And that's not a nice feeling, right? Because frankly, if all the world's information is being cycled up and then I have to go through Google and it tells me to put glue on my pizza, this is not a good outcome for me. And it's not a good outcome for me if they suddenly if they pull everything together and then they put up the barriers to entry or the barriers to access as well. But there are some other things that are going on here too that I want to have a chat about. I said to somebody the other day, the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. And so I want to just think about academic publishing for a moment here too. So it's easy to say, no, we don't want the AI companies just coming in and siphoning up everything and using it for who knows what. And because of the way that our system's set up, one of the key things you think back on is the copyright, right? This is copyright infringement. They shouldn't be able to do it. If we sit it down into copyright, then we still have an issue around who has control and who has ownership, right? So who has control? So for example, in academic publishing, what that does is it says, hey, academic publisher, you now have control. And the net result of that, which we have already seen, is that the academic publishers then go to Microsoft or OpenAI or whoever and do a deal where they get paid a lot of money to give exactly that bit of data over. Or they will work with generative AI to put another wall around it and say, if you want the AI insights from this academic research, you will now have to come through us and buy another service. And no, we're not going to make it transparent. And no, you're not going to be able to independently test it. And yes, you're going to have to trust us. But if you don't trust us, you don't get it. There is one of the things that I think we need to keep remembering, especially in the open community, is why open? Why open? And why open is because control is dangerous. And control is dangerous if it is OpenAI or it is Microsoft, or it is control is dangerous if it's a major academic publisher, or control is dangerous if it's a major news publisher, because they're another group that have done a lot of deals. Anytime we get these points where somebody or one company or one group has control over access to knowledge, to information, to data, and control over the use of that data, we are in a really scary place. And that's why open. Because open was the radical rethinking around that says, no, everybody should be able to see it and everybody should be able to use it. And I think actually it's very easy to get scared around what's coming, but the reaction to then close everything down is not necessarily the right reaction, because it plays actually into some really bad power dichotomies. I don't have the answers, by the way. These are just all provocations, because thinking of answers is way too difficult for my pay grade. But open, I actually think, is still incredibly important when we're thinking about where this landscape is going. As a slight segue too, just for all of those people who are like, oh no, but if you make it open, then it's going to be sucked up. Can we just have a little chat about copyright and open licensing that says what we're talking about with people sucking things up is nothing to do with legality or open, it's everything to do with access. They have sucked up everything, whether it's copyright or Creative Commons, and Creative Commons is a license, and if you do not abide by those license terms, it is exactly the same copyright infringement as all rights reserved copyright. So it's not the legal question. It's just the fact that it's accessible, and that is a different question, and it's a more fundamentally challenging one in a way, because one of those things about open is that they have to be accessible. Little bit ranty, sorry. So I think open's important. I think open's the future. I really legitimately do, but I do think we need to think really carefully about how we do open. And we need to do what some of the other companies are not doing, which is think about How do we do this ethically and responsibly and for a good outcome for the greater good? And I know some of those companies aren't, because I get a job where every now and then I write letters to, say, academic publishers who've done deals with AI companies, and I say to them, "Hi, academic publisher, it's lovely, blah, blah, blah. I notice you've done this deal with this AI company. Could you please tell me what steps you took to responsibly identify and manage Indigenous cultural and intellectual property?" And then they write me one back that says, "Hi Trish, it's lovely to talk to you, blah, 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 blah. We really care about copyright, and we made sure that nothing that we would do would reproduce copyright materials." And you say, "I didn't say copyright. I said Indigenous cultural and intellectual property." And also it's interesting that you talk about copyright, because I know that you've got all the copyright and our academic authors don't have any of it, but that's beside the point. There are interests in this material, and we've been quite bad and quite slow about recognising them. Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. Privacy is a huge one. A huge amount of academic papers that have got personal stories, and we don't deal well with archival collections, for example, that come from things like care home. And so we start to have these things in place that look like ICIP protocols, that look like trauma-informed practice. All of that is incredibly important, and it needs to find a way to translate into whatever this future is. Because at the moment, if we don't actually make a stand on this sort of stuff and use our leverage to say we want a better deal out of this, and that better deal has to not just be transparent about the fact that it's using Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, but maybe not use Indigenous cultural and intellectual property without following proper consultative processes or whatever the particular thing is. So we need to be better, and people who have been thinking about this for a long time need to have a really loud voice. Okay, final bit. You strap in for 5 more minutes? I reckon I've got 5 more minutes. I've got 10 more minutes. I'm running to time. Recap. Knowledge is power. Controlling the container over the course of history and into the future to a large extent means controlling that knowledge. So, what about libraries? This is a controversial statement. Libraries are open infrastructure. There's a really great piece by Danny Kingsley that she published last year that really delves into some of the ridiculous language around open and the co-opting of language about open. And one of the things she goes on about a lot is the difference between open research infrastructure and open research infrastructure. The difference being, of course, like infrastructure that supports open research or infrastructure that in and of itself is open. I would argue that libraries are open infrastructure in the first term of that, first sort of version of that word at the moment. Libraries are infrastructure that is absolutely essential to support open, especially in that information and knowledge area. Libraries are not so great at being open infrastructure, about actually being open. And I think there is a huge amount of work to be done in that space. And props to a couple of people who I can see in the audience, thanks to Alicia, whose great talk yesterday was talking about open infrastructure for libraries. That makes libraries better to be able to be open infrastructure. And a number of other people here as well. But I think we have to take this seriously about both sides of open for libraries. So what do libraries have to do? Now, I realise that most of you are actually not working in libraries, and I'm about to do that this is what libraries could do, but you still have to pay attention because I'm the keynote, okay? Deal? Done. Right, libraries as open infrastructure. What does that actually mean as a responsibility? It means we have to do things openly. So transparency, for example, is really important. And that means both the transparency about what we're doing. So if we, for example, are working with an AI program that's going to look at handwriting recognition or trying to improve speed around metadata and cataloguing, or does something else with the collections, we need to be doing it transparently so people can see it and understand how their results are coming back. We need to be responsible about how we're doing it. We need to make sure that we are, for example, in scholarly publishing, looking at fair and care principles. We need to be thinking about the rights and the interests of people within our collections. I've been involved in a fantastic research project actually looking at library collections, First Nations collections and AI in conjunction with a number of people, including the Jumbunna Centre at UTS. And there are actually some really great projects out there. So it doesn't mean, we can't touch anything that's First Nations and AI and collections, but we have to do it properly, and we have to be transparent even in this area about exactly what we're doing, about what consultation, about what selection criteria we're using. We need to advocate. This is Oliver Twist. He's the world's most famous orphan, which is my stretch to put him in to talk about orphan works. Because I can't put up an orphan work because an orphan work is still in copyright, and then my slide would not be open access, and that would not be cool, would it? No. So we need to continue to advocate. Orphan works is our next one. Some people know what an orphan work is. Some people won't. An orphan work basically is just a work where you don't know who holds the copyright. And that might be because it's a letter and it's signed John. And you're like, well, I don't know who John is, and there is no way of finding John. Or it could be because it's the business correspondence of Whyalla car dealership, which then got acquired by another business, and then that business split, and then that business re-amalgamated, and nobody has the faintest idea whosoever holds the copyright from their 1950s business records. Those items are obviously still in copyright, but if you can't find the copyright holder, you can't clear it. So libraries have a very special exception called 200AB. That means we can basically digitize things and we can put them online and people can see them. But I can't then take that digitized image of an orphan work and put it in my presentation because I'm not a library, so I cannot use section 200AB. And so thinking about, in particular, the reform proposal is for a limited liability scheme for orphan works. So how do we not just make these things available, but how do we make things usable? And if that's important to libraries, then actually we need to be advocating on those front lines of open. Sitting in there with our AI sort of looming crisis around too, when we're thinking about it, what responsibilities have we got around this to make sure that those items, even when digitised and made available, have still got some protections and safeguards around them. And then I want to talk about ability and access. So, we had all of those previous eras, right, where the Great Library of Byzantium or Alexandria or the monks, we're talking about libraries that were open for people to come and see, but there were very few people who had the ability to do so because the literacy rates were low. When we talked about public libraries, one of those things that libraries and school libraries have really done strongly is how do we make these things accessible? That actually means people need the ability. In particular, I want to talk about this one. I said to somebody the other day, if you'd asked me 10 years ago about the future of standalone terminals, computers in libraries, I would have said, geez, we're not going to have those in 10 years. 5.34 million hours on standalone computers last year in public libraries. The need for that has not gone down. And so we are talking about all of those digital and just general exclusion criteria, right? Is something affordable? Is something accessible? Do people have a computer? And the answer is a lot of people have really old mobile phones which don't even upload the latest apps. And you cannot run Centrelink. You can't do anything on Centrelink on a really old mobile phone, trust me. Neither can you access open access publishing really easily on a really old mobile phone. And then do people have the abilities? Do they know how to do it? If Google is coming out and telling them to eat a rock every day for their health, do they have the ability to understand what has changed with Google's search algorithm and Google's way of displaying things that actually they should treat this new answer in a different way than they would have 12 months ago? If we actually want things to be open, we have a responsibility to make sure that everybody in the community has the abilities and the access to be able to use those, because otherwise it's not open, it's just a special little club. Oh yeah, I was meant to have switched to this one, which is some people using computers to make my point, but I didn't. So anyway, people use computers, even in university libraries. And then the final one I want to talk about is community, right? So this is not just the hard practical role, but what are we doing to foster that community? And I'm talking to a room for this who really should be gung-ho all for this, because there have been more than one person who pointed out that they didn't really come for the presentation, so I appreciate you actually still being in here. You came for the morning teas, right? You came for the community. And we see some of those strongest bits of open source, those strongest bits are there because of the community. And what the library is actually actively doing to make those communities, when we are doing STEM or we're running programs, what are we doing to infuse our communities with an ethos around open? Because at the end of the day, communities are greater than the sum of their parts. Really quick recap for everybody still playing along at home. Knowledge is power, which means controlling knowledge gives you power. Controlling the containers in which knowledge is held has traditionally, and I suspect will continue to be, a way of power, right? So when we're talking about open, there's a lot of things, but at the heart of it, it's about power. Open is a radical answer to that. What open does is say, in this world, especially around certain things, we have concerns when power is held by a few people who can control access, who can control what is done with it. Open is the radical solution that says, actually, what we think is important is that everybody can access, can use. And we do that because we're really nice people, and also because communities are greater than the sum of the parts. So I don't know what's going to happen next. I did actually have an extra slide, so now we've got an extra 2 minutes. Because this is actually mildly important. So when we're talking about control, we've talked a lot about business, right? But there is another one that sits in there too, which is just straight out censorship. So one of the things I've spent the last bit over 18 months of my life doing has been responding to some copycat book challenges from the US. And it's been hectic. At the end of 24, we'd had 230 book challenges over the last 2 years. We'd had major incidents. If you want to Google Cumberland City Council or Albany Council, you can have a look at what it is. The librarians on the front line, just so you know, have put their heart and soul onto keeping things in shelves. So, because it's not open if there are no LGBTQIA plus voices in that library. It's not open and accessible if we've self-censored all of the things that might be accused of critical race theory out of the library. But this is a real challenge, and there is a real movement that sits there at the moment that thinks about, well, how do we restrict access to knowledge, especially knowledge that people are scared of. And there are legitimate reasons why people are scared, and I don't take that away. But we need to make sure that we are really consciously thinking about what our responsibility is to make these things available. And I think also it's worth thinking about book challenges, not just about the challenge of people wanting to censor particular voices or particular views, but what does that attack look like if you think of libraries as open infrastructure? So if you've actually drunk my Kool-Aid and you're gung-ho, libraries are open is important, everybody needs access, what does it mean that you're suddenly looking at a sustained attack here and in other places of the world in that piece of infrastructure that actually means that, Sarah's parents can get internet access, and that somebody can actually go in and look up information for themselves, that they will have the ability to know how to use generative AI. And I think there is a real question about why public institutions at the moment, not just libraries, but libraries is where I live, are under such sustained attack. And I think, again, the importance of open and talking about universal access and the needs of the whole community and coming together as a community to look after that is really important. And I want to say thank you too, because I don't know if it's any of you in here, but one of the things that has been absolutely heartwarming as we've gone through these challenges has been the response from the library community. So the people who use libraries, who have come in, I was talking to the people at Albany and they said they got delivered kilos of chocolate, which by the way they ate. There's really no limit to the amount of chocolate that librarians can get through. But it talks to that power and it talks to that resonance. So when we're sitting here and we're having slightly esoteric things about conversations about open, or we're talking about our small communities, never forget that our open source community feeds into a greater community, and that greater community cares. And that's great and wonderful and uplifting, and also a giant responsibility. So that's, yeah, they're my kids. A long time ago. We're doing it for the future. It's my inspiring side. What do we remember? Knowledge is power. Control of knowledge is power. Control of containers quite often means control of knowledge. Radical open source still has to be part of the solution. That's why you're all here, but we need to do it responsibly and carefully. Are you guys up for it? Excellent. Well, now that you've all answered correctly, I'm going to finish. Ciao.
Volunteers team and some nice jams.
I've been wondering the whole time, by the way. Can everyone see that? It's made by a local maker, and I don't know who, but it says Stuart. So Stuart, wherever you are, this is gorgeous.
Yeah, unfortunately, couldn't.